There are moments when life feels like a door that won't open no matter how hard you push. You shove with your shoulder, persist with your hands, lose your breath, and still, nothing gives. But there's a cruel detail. Sometimes the door isn't locked. Sometimes you're pushing the wrong way, and while you wear yourself out, the only thing that grows is the noise inside your head. A lot of people mature carrying a silent habit, forcing things, forcing to be understood, forcing to keep someone close, forcing for family to acknowledge you, forcing for work to finally pay off, forcing for your body to go back to what it was, forcing for the past not to hurt. And it's curious how this impulse usually comes disguised as a virtue. It seems like courage. It seems like discipline. It seems like willpower. But underneath there's a raw fear, the fear of losing control. And when control becomes the main faith, the soul runs out of air. Maybe you know this feeling. You lie down, but your mind stays up. You talk to someone, but inside you're rehearsing responses. You get a compliment, but you're already calculating how long until the next problem. You achieve something, and instead of peace, you feel even more anxiety, as if life is saying, now hold on to it, now prove it, now don't fail. And then your heart turns into a night watchman for a company that never closes. A tiredness that's not just physical, it's existential. As if your whole life depended on your grip, your pressure, your stubbornness. That's when a simple phrase can sound almost offensive. Don't force it. Let God guide. Because for someone trained to survive by controlling everything, letting go feels like abandonment. For someone who learned early that no one would come save them, trusting feels like naivety. For someone who's become competent and responsible, surrendering feels like weakness. But there's a deep difference between giving up and trusting. Giving up is throwing away your own dignity. Trusting is stopping the fight with reality and only fighting what really needs to be tamed. The inner passions, the impulses, the fears that make you run yourself over. The ancient Stoics observed something that still cuts like a blade. You don't control the world, but you can govern yourself. You don't control the economy, the weather, other people's opinions, someone's mood, health in every detail, the fate of the people you love. But you control, with practice and humility, where you put your attention, how you interpret what happens, which values you decide to follow when everything shakes. And that point changes everything, because the impulse to force comes precisely from a confusion, the confusion between responsibility and omnipotence. Responsibility is doing your part. Omnipotence is thinking that life needs to obey your internal script, and if it doesn't, something's wrong with you. When Carl Jung talks in different ways about being guided by something greater, he's not advocating passivity. He's pointing to a phenomenon that a lot of people feel but few name. There's a center in us that knows more than the ego. The ego is the part that plans, compares, protects itself, wants certainty, wants to control the image, wants to avoid shame, wants to avoid pain. The ego shouts. The inner center doesn't shout. It calls quietly. The ego wants immediate results. The inner center wants wholeness. And often, what we call God guiding shows up as a course correction that the ego didn't want, but the soul needed. Have you ever noticed how some losses after a while reveal a strange kind of mercy? A closed door that prevents a disaster. A relationship that ends and, years later, you realize you would have lost yourself trying to hold it up. A failure that forces you down from the pedestal and back to the ground. An illness that teaches the value of slowness. None of this is romanticizing pain. It's recognizing that there's an intelligence in life that doesn't bend to the rush of our pride. And that's exactly why the act of not forcing isn't cowardice. It's reverence. Reverence for the mystery, for reality, for the timing of things, for what ripens without violence. But there's a specific emotional pain that makes a person force even more. The feeling that if they don't do everything, nothing happens. That feeling usually starts early. Maybe you were the adult when you were still a child. Maybe you lived with instability, broken promises, someone who disappeared, someone who demanded, someone who only gave love when you were useful. And then you learn to grip tight, learn to predict, learn to control the environment so you don't get swallowed by chaos. But that mechanism that was once protection later turns into a prison. It starts infiltrating everything. You try to control what others feel, try to control the future, try to control the past with endless explanations. Life gets narrower, and on the outside, you might even seem strong. On the inside, you're always on alert. The mature path isn't breaking that mechanism by force, because then you'd just be forcing the not forcing. The path is noticing what's behind the impulse to grip the world. There's a scared child asking for safety. There's a wound asking for guarantees. There's an inner part saying, if I relax, something bad happens. And that's an intimate, serious, almost sacred conversation. Because it's not just about productivity or well-being. It's about meaning. It's about who you became to survive and who you can become to live. When you try to impose your will on the world, you're usually trying to prevent two things: pain and uncertainty. But life doesn't negotiate with that. Uncertainty is part of the package. Pain, too. The real question is, will you cross the uncertainty with clarity or with despair? Will you cross the pain with dignity or with bitterness? The Stoics talked about a kind of quiet firmness, an inner posture that doesn't depend on the wind. Jung talked about individuation, becoming whole, integrating what you've pushed into the shadow. In other words, it's not the world that needs to be tamed. It's your interior. And then a powerful image emerges. Imagine you're holding a tight rope with all your strength. On the other side is life, pulling too. You get tired, your hands burn, your shoulders harden. You think that if you let go, you lose. But sometimes, when you let go, you don't lose anything. You just discover you were at war with the inevitable. And when the war ends, something inside you starts listening again, starts noticing signs, starts recognizing doors that open without breaking them down, starts feeling what it's like to walk without punishing yourself all the time. Let God guide can be understood as this: stop using the ego as the only pilot. Allow life to participate too. Do your part, yes, with discipline, with courage, with integrity. But stop violating time, people, and yourself to get the guarantee that everything will turn out the way you imagined. Because deep down, the fantasy of total control is an attempt to avoid humility. And humility is the first step to peace. There's a rare serenity that comes when you realize, I don't need to win every battle my mind creates. I don't need to convince everyone. I don't need to chase every crumb of approval. I don't need to solve today what belongs to maturing. I can act with firmness but without despair. I can say no without guilt. I can say yes without betraying myself. I can wait without humiliating myself. I can let go of what doesn't belong to me without feeling like I'm dying. And here's the most delicate turn. When you stop forcing, you start seeing. Because excessive force narrows the vision. It creates a tunnel. It makes you ignore intuition, body limits, warnings from tiredness, signs that something's not aligned. Excessive force makes you efficient, but blind. Lucid surrender makes you attentive. And attention is often what's missing for life to start organizing itself from within. If you've been carrying the world on your chest, maybe it's not a lack of capacity. Maybe it's excess load. And no one goes through decades carrying everything without paying a price. The question that lingers, quiet and incisive, is simple. What are you trying to control to avoid feeling? And what would happen if for a few moments you let go of the rope and just breathed like someone who trusts? There's a kind of control that doesn't make noise. It doesn't show up as an authoritarian person giving orders, or as someone rigid with lists and schedules. It can live in kind, polite, competent people who handle everything. On the outside, you see someone functional. On the inside, there's constant vigilance, as if life is a terrain where any distraction will cost dearly. It's an elegant control, almost invisible, because it often disguises itself as responsibility, prudence, maturity. And still, it has a bitter taste, the taste of always preparing for a danger that might not even exist anymore. Someone who lives like this doesn't truly relax. When something goes right, the mind already looks for the next risk. When something goes wrong, the mind looks for blame, explanations, guarantees. It's as if reality is a machine that needs constant adjustment, and gradually, the person loses an essential ability: serene trust. Not that naive trust that says, nothing bad will happen, but the adult trust that says, if something happens, I'll know how to get through it. In Stoicism, this point is central. Epictetus insisted on the distinction between what depends on us and what doesn't. Not as a catchy phrase, but as an exercise in clarity. Because emotional pain grows when you try to command what doesn't belong to you: other people's opinions, your partner's mood, your grown kid's behavior, recognition at work, the rhythm of the world, the inevitability of time. That's when the impulse to force sets in, and it feeds on a fantasy that with enough effort, you'll avoid vulnerability. But vulnerability isn't a flaw. It's a fact of the human condition. You love and can lose. You build and it can crumble. You plan and can be surprised. You improve and still age. The problem isn't vulnerability. The problem is trying to erase it. Because when you try to erase it, you pay with chronic anxiety, irritation, rigidity, bitterness, and an intimate feeling that nothing is ever enough. Jung would observe this with another lens. When the ego wants to control everything, often it's because it fears its own shadow. The shadow isn't evil in a moralistic sense, it's what you don't want to recognize in yourself. It could be fragility, it could be neediness, it could be envy, it could be anger, it could be a need for approval, it could be fear of abandonment. And when you don't want to look at that, you try to fix the external world, as if the world is to blame for your internal discomfort. You try to guarantee situations, guarantee people, guarantee results. But the shadow doesn't dissolve with guarantees. It dissolves with awareness. That's why for a lot of people, the idea of being guided by something greater scares them, because it implies giving up the illusion that the ego is an absolute king. And the ego hates losing the throne. It prefers tiredness to the unknown, prefers a predictable pain to a freedom it hasn't learned to sustain, prefers the control that suffocates to the surrender that requires faith. And faith here doesn't need to be treated as a narrow religious concept. Faith in the most human sense is the ability to walk without complete guarantees. It's the ability to act with integrity, even when you don't have certainty about the outcome. It's the decision not to corrupt your heart to buy security. There are people who, to feel safe, become hard. Others become people pleasers. Others become cold. Others become controlling. The uncomfortable question is, what have you become to not feel fear? Not forcing doesn't mean crossing your arms. It means swapping internal violence for presence. It means acting without despair. It means refusing anxiety as a way of life. Because anxiety gives the impression that you're doing something, but often you're just burning energy trying to guess the future. The future isn't guessed, it's met. And you meet it better when you're whole, not when you're fragmented into 1,000 imaginary scenarios. Think of a common example: a tough conversation with someone you love. The controlling mind rehearses lines, tries to anticipate reactions, imagines it needs to say it perfectly to not lose the relationship. When the time comes, the body is tense, the voice comes out hard or shaky, and the conversation falls apart. The person concludes, I need to control even more. But the path would be different. Enter the conversation with clarity of values, with honesty, with respect, and accept that you don't control how the other will react. You control your intention, your tone, your courage. The rest is their territory. Another example: work and recognition. You deliver, dedicate yourself, sacrifice rest, and still feel like you need to prove more. Not because the boss asked, but because something inside you asks. An internal judge that's never satisfied. This might have old roots. Maybe you learned that you only deserve love when you're useful, or that you're only seen when you succeed. And then life turns into a courtroom, and you live seeking absolution. Not forcing here, starts when you separate personal value from performance. You do it well because you choose excellence, not because you're begging for dignity. And when we talk about God guiding, a mature way to understand it is noticing the difference between anxious impulse and inner direction. The anxious impulse is urgent, noisy, aggressive. It says, now already my way, or everything crumbles. Inner direction is firm, but serene. It doesn't run, it leads. Sometimes it says, wait, and waiting for the ego feels like punishment. But for the soul, it can be maturation. There are decisions that require waiting not because of lack of capacity, but because of lack of internal alignment. You might even achieve something before the time, but you can't sustain it without losing yourself. Not forcing includes the courage not to harvest before ripening. And that applies to relationships, projects, life changes, even emotional healings. There are pains that don't solve like a math problem. They are crossed. They are worked through. They transform with time, with awareness, with silence, with small repeated choices. The Stoics had a practice that can help a lot here, premeditating adversities. Not to suffer in advance, but to train the mind not to despair. You contemplate the possibility of loss, criticism, delay, unforeseen events, and ask, if this happens, what kind of person do I want to be? That question is an antidote against neurotic control, because it shifts the focus from the result to character. And character is what really depends on you. Jung, in turn, would say that life has a tendency to push you toward wholeness. When you insist on being just a mask, just the strong one, just the efficient one, just the right one, just the one who endures, life finds ways to confront you, sometimes with crises, sometimes with losses, sometimes with restless dreams, sometimes with an emptiness that appears even when everything is fine. It's not punishment. It can be a call to integrate what was left aside. And integrating isn't becoming unstable. It's becoming real. It's admitting, I'm afraid. I feel envy. I feel alone. I want to be seen. I'm tired. When those truths are recognized, the impulse to force decreases because you don't need to use control as anesthesia anymore. You start treating the root, not the symptom. Maybe the most practical question is, how do you recognize that you're forcing? There are subtle signs. Constant hurry, even without need. Irritation when someone doesn't respond in the time you wanted. An exaggerated need to close conversations, resolve everything now, end the day without internal loose ends. Difficulty resting without guilt. A body that doesn't switch off. Clenched jaw, high shoulders, short breath. A mind that replays old dialogues, trying to rewrite the past. And mainly, the feeling that you'll only be at peace when everything is under control. The way out isn't a grand gesture, it's training. It starts with small conscious surrenders throughout the day. A simple example, when something goes off plan, instead of reacting with anger, you name it. This doesn't depend entirely on me. And breathe. Another example. When the mind demands an immediate response, you practice the pause. I can respond tomorrow. Pause isn't weakness, it's mastery. Another example. When you notice you're trying to convince someone to love you, you withdraw with dignity. Not as wounded pride, but as self-respect. Because begged love turns into resentment. And there's a delicate point. Not forcing isn't accepting abuse, isn't tolerating disrespect, isn't erasing yourself. On the contrary, often control arises because you're not setting clear boundaries. You try to control the other because you don't have the courage to say no and hold the consequences. Boundary is action. Control is anxiety. Boundary is clarity. Control is disguised manipulation. When you learn to set boundaries, you need to control less. Deep down, the phrase "don't force" points to a shift in axis. Leave the obsession with the result and enter fidelity to the path. Do what's right, with a clean heart, and accept that life has movements that don't ask for your approval. There's a kind of peace that comes when you realize, I can walk without violating the world, without violating people, without violating myself. I can act with firmness but without panic. I can trust without becoming naive. I can let go without abandoning myself. There's a common mistake that confuses a lot of mature people, believing that trusting means staying still, as if letting go of control was synonymous with crossing your arms, accepting anything, and calling it divine will. But there's a clear difference between surrender and omission. Surrender is presence without rigidity. Omission is absence without courage. Surrender is acting with a clean heart, without internal blackmail. Omission is using spirituality as an excuse to avoid tough decisions. When the person doesn't see the difference, they swing from one extreme to the other. Either force everything with anxiety, or abandon everything with indifference. The middle path requires discernment. And discernment doesn't come from accelerated thinking. It comes from well-done silence. The Stoics talked about a mind trained to see clearly what depends on us. Jung would talk about a consciousness capable of hearing the unconscious without being swallowed by it. And when we talk about God guiding, the practical question becomes, how to distinguish inner direction from emotional impulse? How to separate the guiding voice from the one that just fears? Emotional impulse has hurry. It demands immediate response, charges certainties, creates artificial urgency. It says, do it now, or you'll lose. Inner direction is usually firm, but serene. It might even lead to a courageous decision, but it doesn't come with panic. Often, anxiety shouts action when the heart asks for clarity. The person moves a lot to not feel. But movement isn't progress when the mind is in flight. Force without direction turns into wear. Surrender with clarity turns into alignment. It's worth observing the body because the body often knows before the mind. When there's anxiety, the chest tightens, breathing shortens, the jaw locks, hurry sets in as if the world is on fire. When there's inner direction, there can be fear, sure, but there's also a kind of internal uprightness, as if something says, go, even trembling. The difference is subtle. Fear can accompany both. Despair usually accompanies only the impulse. And despair almost always pushes toward attempts to control people, time, and future. The Stoics would call this slavery to passions, not in the sense of forbidden emotion, but in the sense of emotion ruling life. When emotion rules, the person negotiates values, says what they don't think, accepts what hurts, chases what humiliates, insists on what destroys. The mind justifies, just this once. But just this once usually turns into habit. And over time, the soul gets smaller, not from lack of strength, but from lack of truth. Jung would add an even more delicate detail. The ego doesn't just want to control the world. Often it wants to control its own image, wants to seem strong, wants to seem right, wants to seem desirable, wants to seem indispensable. When life threatens the image, the ego reacts as if it's dying. A compulsion arises to prove, convince, win. And when it can't, resentment arises. True surrender breaks precisely with the idolatry of the image. It returns the person to a simpler point. What's integral to do now, even if no one applauds? Here comes an idea that, for a lot of people, changes how they walk through life. Act without clinging. Do without demanding. Sow without negotiating with time. There are decisions that ask for attitude, but don't ask for attachment. A request for forgiveness, for example. You can ask for forgiveness with sincerity and still not receive welcome. A well-placed boundary can create distance. An ethical choice can create financial loss. The mature question isn't how to guarantee it'll work out, but how to keep character when there's no guarantee. This is Stoicism in its pure state. Do what's right because it's right, not because it's safe. And when we talk about God guiding, a lot of people imagine theatrical signs. But in real life, the guidance can come discreetly. A persistent discomfort, a dream that touches an old wound, a meeting that opens a question, a repeated obstacle that forces reviewing a path, a fatigue that denounces a wrong lifestyle. Jung would call attention to the symbolic language of dreams and to synchronicity, when external events seem to talk with internal movements. Not to turn into superstition, but to train attention. Because a life lived on autopilot misses obvious signs. And here's a risk: turning any coincidence into an order. The anxious mind loves signs because signs seem to guarantee. But life wasn't made to work like a map with lit signs at every corner. What exists, more often, is a combination of reason, values, and listening. Reason to evaluate consequences. Values to decide who you want to be. Listening to notice when the ego is trying to buy control with hurry. God guiding can mean exactly this. You don't make decisions just to escape discomfort. You make decisions to honor a greater meaning. How to practice in everyday life. It starts with a gesture that seems small. Stop using anxiety as a compass. When a decision arises, observe. Does the choice come from fear or from uprightness? From neediness or from purpose? From vanity or from service? The same action can have opposite motivations. A job change can be escape from your own emptiness, or it can be a necessary step to live with more truth. A breakup can be whim, or it can be preservation of dignity. The world sees the act. God, if you believe, sees the intention. And Jung would say, the unconscious also sees and demands coherence in the form of symptoms when external life denies internal life. There's another essential point. Surrender doesn't mean tolerating the intolerable. A person can say God knows and stay in an abusive relationship out of fear of being alone. Can call patience what is cowardice. Can call humility what is submission. Wisdom asks for firmness. The Stoics didn't defend accepting injustice as unquestionable fate. They defended keeping the soul just while acting in the world with courage. Surrender, therefore, can also be getting up and leaving, can also be reporting, can also be saying enough without hate, without spectacle, without need to defeat the other. Jung talked about individuation as a process of becoming whole. Whole isn't perfect, whole is true. And personal truth rarely fits simple formulas. There are moments to advance, moments to wait, moments to retreat, moments to restart. The ego wants a fixed rule, always fight, or always surrender. Life, however, asks for situational maturity. Fight when consciousness commands. Let go when reality doesn't yield. Insist when there's meaning. Give up when insistence turned into self-aggression. A useful exercise is observing where life demands strength and where it demands softness. Strength to keep good habits, to say hard truths, to fulfill duties, to choose what's healthy even without immediate pleasure. Softness to accept what doesn't change, to respect time, to not crush people with expectation, to not crush your own soul with demands. Many confuse softness with weakness because they were raised in hardness. But softness can be a superior form of power. Power over yourself. Another exercise, very practical, is learning to endure the pause. The pause usually reveals what noise hides. In the pause, the person notices that part of the control came from fear of feeling sadness, fear of feeling loneliness, fear of feeling uselessness. When you don't run, you find what you've been avoiding. And paradoxically, that's where healing starts. Control tries to avoid pain, but prolongs the pain. Surrender allows feeling, and therefore transforms. For those with faith, prayer can be lived as ego surrender, not as a list of demands. Something simple like, grant clarity to act with uprightness and serenity to accept what doesn't belong to me. For those who don't use religious language, the idea remains, align with values greater than your own ego. The point isn't the label, it's the internal quality. And maybe the most honest question of all is what inside you still wants to control God. Because deep down, many try to use spirituality as a contract. I behave and receive security. But spiritual maturity isn't bargaining, it's trust with responsibility. You do good because you love good. You discipline yourself because you want to be free. You let go of what you don't control because you want to live without internal war. And when life surprises, you don't call it personal injustice. You call it human condition and respond with dignity. There's a strange and deep peace when the person realizes, doesn't need to prove anything to exist, can act with excellence without torturing themselves, can love without begging, can wait without humiliating themselves, can lose without destroying themselves, can restart without drama. And when that happens, what we call divine guidance looks less like an external push and more like an internal reorganization, as if the soul finally stopped fighting the wind and learned to adjust the sails. There's a silent form of suffering that almost no one calls by name, the war against what is. You wake up and there's already an invisible list of internal demands. People should be fairer, the body should respond faster, the past should have been different, The present should be clearer, the future should be safer. And when reality doesn't obey, a tension arises that accumulates like rust in the soul. The curious thing is that often you don't even notice you're at war. You just feel tiredness, irritation, lack of patience, a weight that doesn't have a simple explanation. It's at this point that the idea of don't force becomes more than advice. It turns into a diagnosis. When you force, it's not always because you want something a lot. Sometimes it's because you can't stand the feeling of not knowing. Sometimes it's because you confuse love with control. Sometimes it's because you're trying to protect yourself from an old wound by repeating a known pattern. Grip the world so it doesn't grip you. But life, at some point, usually resists. And that resistance can be interpreted as bad luck, as injustice, as destiny's persecution. But it can also be interpreted as a mirror. Stoicism teaches that external reality is the training field for character. Life doesn't promise comfort, it offers occasion. What happens, happens. The issue is, what do you do inside with what happens? What forms in you when the plan fails? What reveals itself when praise doesn't come? What appears when the person you expected doesn't match? For the Stoic, the obstacle isn't just something to remove. It's an invitation to practice virtue. Patience, courage, temperance, justice. Virtues aren't pretty ideas. They're internal muscles. And muscle only grows with resistance. Jung, on the other hand, would see life's resistance as a conversation between the conscious and the unconscious. When you insist too much on a direction that only serves the ego, life can start putting locks. Not because there's punishment, but because there's imbalance. Sometimes you're chasing a version of yourself that doesn't match your soul anymore. Sometimes you're trying to live to please an image, a role, an expectation, and not to live a truth. And then symptoms arise: anxiety, apathy, causeless irritation, restless dreams, loss of meaning, an emptiness that doesn't resolve with more achievements. When we talk about God guiding, a mature way to understand is this: life, through mysterious paths, tends to break what's false in us, not to humiliate, but to free. But liberation doesn't always seem gentle at first, because the ego clings to the known, even when the known hurts. There are people who prefer familiar pain to unknown healing, prefer the lukewarm relationship to temporary loneliness, prefer the job that sickens to the uncertainty of restarting, prefer the role of strong to the risk of being seen as human. And when life resists, it stirs precisely those attachments. Think about insisting on keeping a relationship that's already turned into bargaining for crumbs. The person says, "I need to make it work." And behind that, there's something more. If I can't, it means I'm not lovable. The insistence turns into an attempt to prove value. You don't just want the relationship, you want the confirmation. And then force conversations, force presence, force plans, force promises. But forced love turns into theater, and theater over time turns into resentment. Not forcing in this case isn't giving up on loving, it's giving up on begging for love. It's allowing the other to show through actions what they really have to offer. And if it's little, you don't try to transform the source. You look for cleaner water or learn to live without that source. Now think about the obsession with correcting the past. You replay scenes in your mind, as if you could change the ending. You seek a conversation that never happened, an apology that never came, a recognition that never arrived. The past turns into a room you enter every day to rearrange the furniture, even knowing no one lives there anymore. Jung would say that unresolved past creates complexes, emotional cores that capture psychic energy. The Stoic would say you're giving your peace to something that no longer depends on you. Not forcing here is an act of courage. Stop trying to get from the past what it can't give you and start building in the present the dignity that was missing. And the body? The body is another place where life resists. Many people try to force the body as if the body were a project to be dominated. They fight aging as if aging were a moral failure. Demand performance from an organism that's already given signs. And when the body responds with pain, insomnia, fatigue, the person revolts. But the body, in many cases, isn't betraying you. It's protecting you from a lifestyle that's turned into constant aggression. Not forcing here isn't neglect. It's learning to respect limits without falling into self-pity. It's swapping the idea of dominating the body for inhabiting the body. There's something deeply spiritual in learning to breathe calmly and accept that life has rhythms that don't bend to vanity. There's also the resistance of the external world, projects that don't move, doors that don't open, answers that don't come. And it's tempting to interpret that as personal failure. But often life is just saying, not yet. And not yet is a hard phrase for someone trained to solve. Maturity learns to endure the interval, because the interval is where the soul matures. You become someone capable of sustaining what you desire without destroying yourself along the way. But how do you know if you're facing a not yet or a no? That question is human, and no one answers with absolute certainty. What exists is a set of internal and external signs that help in discernment. When you insist on something and lose your peace, lose your clarity, lose your self-respect, lose your center, that usually indicates that the insistence is turning into self-abandonment. When you insist and, despite the difficulty, feel more integral, more true, more aligned with your values, it might be that the difficulty is just the price of building. The criterion, therefore, isn't just the result. It's what you're becoming on the path. The Stoics would ask a simple question. Is this insistence in accordance with virtue? Are you being fair to yourself and others? Are you being temperate or obsessive? Are you being courageous or stubborn? Are you being wise or driven by pride? Because pride is a strange force. It makes you confuse I can't lose with I shouldn't continue. It makes you insist not because it's right, but because you can't stand the idea of not winning. And then life turns into an arena. And you turn into a gladiator in a fight no one asked for. Jung would ask another question. Does this insistence serve your wholeness or serve your character? Serve your process of becoming whole or serve your fear of being ordinary? Many ambitions are legitimate, but some ambitions are just attempts to fill an internal hole. You don't want the goal, you want to feel sufficient. And when the goal doesn't come, you feel threatened. It's as if life is constantly judging your value. That view is cruel, and it feeds the impulse to force. True surrender starts when you shift the source of value. You're not valuable because you won, because you were chosen, because you were praised, because you were understood. You're valuable because you exist, and because you can choose to live with uprightness. This isn't a pretty phrase, it's a psychological base. When value depends on the world, you become the world's hostage. When value comes from consciousness, you become free to act with courage without despair. There's a simple practice that helps a lot to reduce the impulse to force. Repeat, in moments of tension, something like, I do what belongs to me and accept the rest. This seems little, but it's an internal reordering. You separate effort from attachment. You keep working, talking, building, caring. But stop demanding that life pay you in the coin you decided. Life isn't a fair trade machine. Sometimes it gives late. Sometimes it gives differently. Sometimes it takes to open space. And no matter how much that hurts, fighting against that dynamic only adds suffering to suffering. When life resists, you can ask, what's being asked of me now? Patience, boundary, humility, courage, silence, renunciation, change of route? That question is a practical way to make yourself available to be guided without turning passive. Because being guided isn't stopping action. It's acting in cooperation with reality, not at war with it. And there's a last layer. Sometimes what you call life's resistance is just the reflection of your own internal resistance. You say you want to change, but resist the discomfort of changing. You say you want peace, but resist the silence that peace requires. You say you want a healthy relationship, but resist abandoning patterns that give you a sense of control. You say you want purpose, but resist accepting that purpose usually involves responsibility and renunciation. Life then seems stuck, but the stuckness might be in the soul. And that's not blame, it's invitation. If you recognize this without punishing yourself, something starts to loosen. Because rigidity isn't strength. Rigidity is hardened fear. True strength is flexible. It adapts, learns, changes, waits, restarts, without losing dignity. And it's that strength that brings you closer to a trust that doesn't depend on immediate results. In the end, life doesn't usually defeat us with big tragedies. It wears us down with small daily wars. The war to be accepted, the war to predict everything, the war to not seem fragile, the war to keep things the way the mind demands. And that's why the decision not to force is so serious. Because it's not about getting light. It's about stopping bleeding inside in the name of a control that will never be complete. There's a silent maturity when you finally understand that controlling isn't the same as conducting. Conducting is choosing a north and walking with discipline. Controlling is trying to force the world to follow a script so you don't have to feel fear, frustration, or loss. Conducting requires virtue. Controlling requires tension. Conducting strengthens. Controlling sickens. Stoicism calls you back to the essential. What depends on you? The way you respond, the way you interpret, the way you stay just when it would be easy to become cruel, the way you stay sober when it would be easy to get lost in reactions. The world changes, people oscillate, destiny surprises. But there's a place in you that can become stable, not by rigidity but by clarity. When you live from that place, despair loses its voice. And Jung, with his language of depth, reminds something equally decisive. There's in you an intelligence greater than the ego that wants to control. There's a center that seeks wholeness, not image. And often that center manifests precisely when life prevents your impulse to force, as if saying, this way you don't grow. This way you betray yourself. This way you get lost. Life's resistance, instead of enemy, can be a correction, a protection, an invitation. Not for you to give up on existence, but to give up living as if your soul's value depended on immediate results. Letting God guide can be understood very concretely as this. Don't make decisions from panic. Don't negotiate dignity for relief. Don't use anxiety as a compass. Do your part with uprightness and after, let go of the part that doesn't belong to you. This doesn't eliminate pain, but eliminates extra suffering, the suffering of banging against the wall and calling that virtue. Maybe you notice, looking with honesty, that much of what you call struggle was in fact fear of losing control, fear of not being chosen, fear of being forgotten, fear of being ordinary, fear of failing, fear of being alone. And fear, when not recognized, turns into a hard force that grips everything: relationships, work, body, time, spirituality. But recognizing fear doesn't weaken. Recognizing fear takes away its command. From that recognition, you can act with more truth. Life doesn't ask you to be passive. It asks you to be integral. Integrity is doing what's right even when uncomfortable. It's saying no when yes would be a silent betrayal. It's waiting when running would just be fleeing. It's leaving when insisting turned into self-aggression. It's restarting without hating yourself. It's accepting limits without falling into bitterness. It's learning that there's strength also in softness, and dignity also in pause. And maybe the biggest sign that you're being led by something greater isn't an external miracle but an internal transformation. The reduction of despair. When despair decreases, you start hearing better. You start noticing what was drowned out by noise before. You start feeling when you're trying to gain the world and losing your soul. You start choosing with more calm. And gradually, your external life might even stay imperfect, but your internal life stops being a battlefield. If this message touched some sensitive point in you, write in the comments which area of your life is demanding the most control. Relationships, work, family, health, time, or tough decisions. I read them and it helps create content more aligned with what you're going through. If you want to support the channel, leave your like, share with someone who's tired of fighting against everything, and subscribe to follow reflections that strengthen the mind and calm the heart. And when you finish this video, do a simple gesture, almost invisible but powerful. Breathe deep and ask yourself with honesty, what am I forcing? And what would happen if I trusted a little more today?